During the 6th century AD, long past the days of Augustus, the Roman Empire still stood strong. After the conquests of Justinian and Belisarius, almost all of the Mediterranean was brought once again under Roman rule. Nevertheless, it would take less than 50 years for all of these achievements to be reversed by a single usurper. Phokas. There has never been a man so corrupt sitting on the imperial throne. As soon as he became emperor, he focused solely on the destruction of his internal enemies, executing whoever dared to stand in his path. And it was not long until the empire's external foes noticed. Catching the Romans off guard, they attacked the headless state with no mercy. Justinian's once prosperous empire was slowly eroding under Phocas's administration, with Italy, the Balkans, and the East being under constant threat. The only thing certain was that the Romans were about to face an existential crisis, the likes of which they had never seen before. Meanwhile, on the eastern borders of the Roman world, an endless caravan moved across the land towards the magnificent city of Ctesiphon. This was the mighty capital of the Sasanian Empire. Descendants of the great Persians, the Sasanians had achieved to free their homeland after centuries of Greek and Parthian rule. Now, as masters of their own selves, they expanded their domains over all of the known East. Their leader, an ambitious young man named Khosrow, is determined to avenge the enemies of the Persians and bring all the world under the eternal flame of Ahura Mazda, and no Roman would stand in his path. But the northern frontiers of the empire are also in peril. A confederation of steppe peoples, led by the Avars, have established themselves across the Danube. Rumored to never unmount their horses, those people brought terror to the weak barbarians once leaving outside the Roman borders. Taking advantage of the power vacuum, they have enslaved all of the previous tribes. Their battle formations resemble a slave caravan, with Slavs and Goths acting as the numerous infantry, while the Avars themselves, clad in armor and skilled in archery, would initiate the fight and lead the huge crowd. Even if an unorganized opponent, it would take many Roman men and resources to contain the Avars. It would be during these troubled times that one of the greatest emperors of Eastern Rome would rise to glory, Heraclius. His father, the exarch of Carthage, would organize a swift expedition out of Africa so that Heraclius and his brothers would depose the corrupt emperor Phokas. And so they sailed against the imperial forces both in Egypt and against the capital itself, Heraclius being the one to lead the daring expedition against Constantinople. But in Heraclius's good fortune, the empire's subjects had already had enough under Phocas's tyranny. Thus Heraclius managed to easily enter the city, with Phocas's people defecting to him en masse. It did not take long for him to enter into the palace of the tyrant. Once he spotted the now frightened Phocas, and knowing the destruction he had brought on to the empire, he asked, "Is this how you have ruled?" But it was Phocas's reply, who now knew it was time to pay for his deeds, that would haunt Heraclius forever. "And will you rule better?" Heraclius, driven by the fury of his youth, killed the tyrant on the spot. Once Phocas was dead, everyone in the capital greeted the regime change with hope, and thus, with the internal affairs settled, Heraclius set forth to deal with the external enemies. Two huge Sasanian forces were marching into Roman lands, led by two skilled Persian commanders, Shahin and Shahbaraz, the wild boar of Persia, as his name suggests, a warlike commander with great aspirations. Heraclius, gathering the underpaid and demoralized army of Phokas, hastily marched towards Antioch to intercept those mighty opponents in their attempt to capture the city. But despite his bold actions to this point, he had no real battlefield experience. His disheartened troops were no match for the Persian war machine who trampled the Romans. Within just 3 years into his reign, he stood defeated and disgraced, and the worst was yet to come. As the Roman army was now out of the picture, the Persians moved forward into the province of Syria, with Shahbaraz capturing Damascus and Antioch, the great Roman metropolis on the banks of the Orontes. The city's patriarch was slain and its population deported. Syria was engulfed in the flames of Ahura Mazda. But an even grimmer fate awaited Jerusalem. Shahbaraz managed to infiltrate the walled city with the help of the local Jews, but the brutality of the massacre that the Persians conducted was unimaginable, as described by an eyewitness. Anyone who ran away in terror they caught hold of, and if any cried out from fear, they roared at them with gnashing of teeth, and by breaking their teeth, forced them to close their mouths. They even slaughtered tender infants on the ground. And as if these were not enough, they captured and stole Christianity's most valuable relic, the true cross on which Jesus himself made his sacrifice. And as the Sasanians conquered the eastern provinces, the enemies from the west also decided to feast on the now weak Romans, the Avars. With the Roman forces destroyed and paralyzed, they seized the opportunity to establish themselves in most of the Balkan countryside. They raided and pillaged fields, villages, and small towns, even though their ambitions were not limited there, as they were openly challenging the walled city of Thessalonica, as their Slav vassals were used as meat shields against the city's mighty walls. Meanwhile, the Sassanids would become even more aggressive, emboldened by their victories. In 615, Shahin would advance deep into Anatolia, up to Chalcedon, directly opposite to the capital, bringing destruction to the heart of the empire. It now seems that God has forsaken the Romans, as the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse descended upon the empire: conquest, war, famine, and death. Heraclius was now desperate. With no more realistic choices, he decided to send an embassy to Khosrow, offering the Roman Empire as a vassal to the King of Kings, a humiliating treaty. But the overconfident Khosrow was not willing to accept even this most generous proposal. The war would drag on. He wished to see the Romans completely annihilated. The response shocked the already desperate Heraclius. Maybe Phokas was right. Maybe Heraclius could not rule better. It was indeed under his own administration that the empire came at its lowest. But unknowingly to Khosrow, the refusal of this humiliating offer would plant the seed of his own undoing. Now the Romans, with their backs on the wall, had no other option than to fight back. Even if the most dreaded calamities had struck the Romans and had brought them to their knees, they also created conditions unique to the empire's long history. It was one of the rare occasions that an emperor, after enduring so many failures, faced no internal opposition. All of the Roman society, from peasants up to priests and generals, had come to the understanding that there would be no salvation unless they all stuck together into one and support the emperor, who, even though was unable to yet deliver any victories, was proven to be a man of honesty and valor. That is why no soldier complained when Heraclius cut their pay in half by providing their salaries with a devalued coin. The inscription on the new currency read, "God save the Romans." The soldiers knew there was simply no other choice. But before things could get any better, one last blow was to be dealt to the Roman state, which was already on its last legs. In 619, Sharbaraz's forces invaded the last province that still provided the empire with significant wealth and resources: Egypt. Now Heraclius could only count on two advantages that the empire still had left: the impregnable walls of her cities and the strength of the church. The religious institution of the empire not only exercised great influence upon the people, but also possessed immense amounts of wealth, gathered through the centuries. Patriarch Sergius, seeing no other hope, liquidated a big part of the church's fortune in favor of the war effort. Thus the Romans gave their emperor one last chance. Everything now hung on a thread. The church treasures that Heraclius received were the empire's last funds, just enough to keep the state afloat and raise a standing army. But the emperor's next move would have to be one of planning and caution. So he vanished from public life for several months. It was said that a very specific book came into the emperor's possession, a book that the emperor studied day and night, a book that contained the knowledge of how the Romans should deal with their enemies, a war manual written by the great warrior emperor Maurice, the Strategicon. The famous emperor had outlined 3 pieces of advice for fighting against the Persians: to fight them on level plains so that the Roman infantry can deploy their advanced tactics, fight them in the cold, and take advantage of their weak night camps. Those 3 pieces of advice would give Heraclius the edge on his encounters with the Sassanids. Heraclius emerged out of his solitude a changed man. Now more than ever, he was determined to put an end to the empire's humiliation, with a series of moves that would make or break the Roman state. But first, he needed a trained and loyal army. The emperor gathered the demoralized troops, who after more than a decade of continuous defeats, finally rejoiced by seeing the emperor within their ranks. Heraclius became one of them, enduring the same hardships and eating the same food. The emperor got accustomed himself in the ways of war and battle, and organized staged fights between his men. He taught them war signals, battle cries, and instructed them on all the military endeavors that he had studied. And with him, he carried a holy icon of the Mother of Christ, a relic said to have not been made by a human hand, as both he and his men knew that this war was no simple endeavor. The Sassanids had stolen the true cross. They had killed holy men and disgraced the empire's pious cities. This war would be a clash of faith, a crusade. It was in the summer of 622 that Heraclius would start his offensive. Alongside him, a moderately large army, no bigger than 30,000 men. Starting from Constantinople, the forces landed in Bithynia and advanced into Nicomedia for training, to instill discipline and gain God's favor. Heraclius set to purify the army and the people. He ordered a 3 days of fasting and prayer for the troops, while monasteries and churches also contributed to the war effort. Heraclius's goal was simple. Neither he nor his men were ready for a full-scale offensive against the Sassanids. The campaign of that year would be an expedition to restore morale to the army and let the people of the remaining parts of the East know that the emperor still got their back, despite the Sasanian advances. The Roman force started its careful march towards the east in the beginning of autumn, with the goal to reach Pontus. Their actions, as anticipated, caught the attention of the Sassanids, who were ransacking Cappadocia at the time. Heraclius was exposed. The Sassanids could not lose this opportunity. Khosrow ordered Sharbaraz, stationed in Egypt, to attack the force of Heraclius. The skilled general was quick to reach the vicinity of the Roman force, and thus the chase begun. Heraclius' plan was based on the advice he gathered from the strategikon of Maurice. He would have Sharbaraz's trained army run after him through Asia Minor, trying to lure him on an engagement in the open field, which would favor the Roman infantry tactics. However, the Roman soldiers felt terror in the news of the approaching Persian army. The tales of the Persian victories and the subsequent brutalities in Antioch and Jerusalem, coupled with the capture of the Holy Cross, instigated a severe moral hit on the Romans, who had thus become dreadful of the Persians and their leaders, performing their march under constant pressure. Sharbaraz tried to initially block Heraclius' easternwards advance by placing his forces in Euheta, sacking the city in the process. Heraclius, foreseeing the Sassanid plan, outmaneuvered his force around the Persians, using a series of feint attacks. In turn, Sharbaraz tried to also outmaneuver Heraclius, an action which led to failure. Heraclius then encamped his army on a flat plain, which deterred the Persians from attacking. As indicated in the strategikon, it would be in the end of autumn that Heraclius would then deploy a common trick to lure the Persians out of their positions. He sent a small force to be chased by the Sassanids, who, tired from the long campaign, fell into Heraclius's trap. It was the perfect setting: a flat plain, cold weather, and a surprise attack. The Optimates, the elite troops of the empire, massacred the Persians. Heraclius's genius was proven in this tactical victory near Ophlimus. After 2 decades of war, the Sassanids were defeated. It was time to finally turn the tide, but there was still much way to go. Sharbaraz managed to retreat without many losses, and Heraclius was forced to turn back to Constantinople as one more enemy awaited him close to the capital: the Avars. Their intentions had been made clear. After pillaging the Balkan interior, they had set their sight on the ultimate price: Constantinople. With the city's outskirts already on fire, Heraclius had no choice. He offered the Khagan 200,000 solidi as a tribute, as well as his own son and nephew as hostages. But Heraclius knew that he was just buying some time. The Avars would be back, but he first needed to deal with the Sassanids, and this time he would do so with the most daring campaign in Roman history. After temporarily securing his rear, Heraclius prepared an offensive against Persia. But this would not be just one more usual campaign. His plan was not to simply drive back the Persians, but rather to deliver a surgical blow deep within their overstretched empire. Heraclius' goal for 624 would be the capture of Armenia, so as to position himself within a striking distance from Ctesiphon and divert the Sassanid attention from the Roman mainland. Thus he marched swiftly through the mountain passes of Cappadocia towards Theodosiopolis and recovered the city for the Romans. Next, he would cross into territories outside the empire's reach, at the fortress of Dvin, within Sasanian Armenia. Dvin, a once proud Christian Armenian city, was now reduced to a provincial capital by the Sassanids, a place where the fire of Ahura Mazda now lit strong. Heraclius managed to capture and burn the city, gaining the attention of Khosrow. With Shahin and Sharbaraz being stationed in the west, Khosrow assembled himself a huge army of 40,000 to deal with Heraclius. Undeterred, Heraclius with his 24,000 moved even deeper within enemy territory, reaching the Persian holy city of Ganzak. It was in the days of Emperor Julian that the Romans had for the last time campaigned so deep towards the east, a land of wonder, mystery, and dark practices. It was in Ganzak that they would witness the true nature of their enemy, Dakma, the Tower of Silence. But this magnificent building hid a gruesome truth. Atop of its elaborately designed walls lay a floor dedicated to corpses, left in the open so that carrion birds could feast on the decomposing flesh. This horrendous act was performed by the Persians, worshippers of Ahura Mazda, so as to not litter the earth with human impurities. Heraclius and his men were disgusted. Even though they had never expected to reach that deep into Persia, it was even more surprising for them to witness such horrors. Indeed, the emperor was right. They had embarked not in a war of conquest, nor in one of defense. They already knew by now that this was a war of faith. Khosrow's army was approaching with a fast pace. Thousands of men from across the lands of Persia, ready to fall upon the Romans like a hammer, especially now that they were fighting on their own ground. But Heraclius stood firm. Once the Sassanid vanguard attacked, the Romans repulsed them with ease. It did not take long for the King of Kings to realize that Heraclius had learned from his past mistakes. The Roman army was no more the demoralized crowd he had faced 10 years ago. Thus, not willing to take the risk of a defeat, Khosrow retreated to fight Heraclius under more favorable terms of his own choosing. This was an unprecedented victory. Heraclius had made the ultimate gamble, and it had paid off. His surprise attack deep within the Persian territory demonstrated the Sassanid weakness, and now it was time for revenge. For the sack of Antioch and Jerusalem, the fire-worshipping Zoroastrians of Ganzak would be paid back with their own coin, Inferno. But unknowingly to the Zoroastrian monks, the Persians had already offered Ganzak as a sacrifice to the god of fire, so as to keep Heraclius within the region. With the Romans stranded, Khosrow was determined to deliver the finishing blow to Heraclius. With the spring of 625, Khosrow recalled his generals, Shahin and Sharbaraz, to the eastern front. Now with 3 armies against Heraclius's force, deep within Persia, Khosrow planned to trap and eliminate the emperor. Heraclius, after avenging the injustices done to the Christians, moved towards the Caspian Sea, to the lands of Albania, where he wintered, anticipating the Persian armies. Even if greatly outnumbered, he was prepared to fight them separately, on advantageous conditions. First, he tried to sow confusion and rivalry within the enemies by sending fake deserters towards the army of Sharbaraz. The men claimed to have been defeated by Shahin, and that the Roman army was retreating. The ambitious Sharbaraz, catching the bait, hastened his march and loosened his formations to pursue the supposedly beaten Romans and be the one to deal the final blow. This move disorganized the Sasanian forces. Heraclius first attacked Sharplakan, whom he easily routed, and then rushed towards the west to confront Shahin. The once dreadful general was now isolated, and was thus swiftly defeated by the unwavering momentum of the Romans. But Heraclius was not done yet. He did not wish to retreat back to safety, and thus the disoriented Sharbaraz caught up, having linked up with the other Persian armies' remnants. The three Sassanid generals were now jointly pursuing Heraclius north of Lake Van, but the marshes of the region slowed them down significantly. Nevertheless, Sharbaraz ordered 6,000 men to ambush Heraclius, but the Romans were prepared, and instead, they ambushed themselves, the Persian camp, destroying the myth of Sassanid invincibility once and for all, as Sharbaraz himself was caught in his sleep and had to flee for his life. After this victory, the Romans rested for some time close to the lake, and then they finally made their way home. First, however, they would recapture two more fortresses, Amida and Martyropolis on the north of the Tigris River, but the Persians would make one final attempt to eliminate Heraclius' army and began their pursuit once more, having now recovered from their defeats. Moving at impressive speed, Sharbaraz managed to outmaneuver the Romans and position himself on the western bank of the river Sarus, blocking their way home. Now, even though Heraclius and his men had managed to beat all the odds, everything could go to waste if they didn't manage to return safely back to their posts. But by now, those once timid men had become wild beasts, hungry for war and battle, and hastily attempted a bridge crossing. The Persians held their ground thanks to their defensive position, and it seemed like they would finally prevail and redeem themselves from their previous failures. However, this was not to be. Heraclius doubled down on the frontal assault, and by charging with all his army, he finally broke through the Sasanian lines. It was one more astonishing victory, one in the name of Christ. Now finally the Romans could return home, after having stubbed the Persian beast in its soft spot and narrowly escaping from its jaws. Heraclius finally proved his worth, having beaten the enemies that almost brought him down 10 years before, and having his great gambles pay off. He had taken a relatively inexperienced army of 24,000 and beat enemies numbering many times his size. Through brilliant cunning and military strategy, he avenged the desecration of Christianity's most holy sites, and most importantly, he showed the world that the Persians can bleed. Yet even after all this struggle, the Sassanids still hold Syria and Egypt, and most importantly, the true cross. Nevertheless, whispers started reaching the great king's ear. The illusion of his invincibility was shattered, and people started to notice. The now paranoid Khosrow refuses peace talks, each loss only fueling his lust for revenge. A most devious plan was on the making. If he could not beat Heraclius on the battlefield, he would find another way. Dark clouds gather over Constantinople. The King of Kings makes a pact with the demons of the steppes, living south of the Danube. The Avars are back. They were promised great plunder and a strong alliance if they broke their truce with Heraclius and attack from the Balkans. And so, the ruthless nomads invaded the Eastern Roman Empire once again. And after they savagely ravaged the countryside, they laid siege on Constantinople. Smoke and blood was in the air, and with the emperor far away in the east, only a miracle could save the Queen of Cities. Surrounded on all sides, and with peace being further away than ever before, Heraclius, armed with the prayers of his people, had no option but to continue the fight to the death. The paranoid King of Kings would give his two greatest generals one last chance to redeem themselves after they have been humiliated time after time by the Romans. Shahin would engage Heraclius in the mountains of Pontus, while Sharbaraz was tasked with helping the Avars siege Constantinople. Thus, in the beginning of summer of 626 AD, the Avars and their Slav vassals encircled the city, while at the same time the Persian general Sharbaraz arrived on the opposite side of the Bosporus Gulf with his own forces. The Romans, however, possess a strong navy and the colossal Theodosian walls. The city's defense was also assigned to skilled and trustworthy people, handpicked by Heraclius himself, as well as Patriarch Sergios, the spiritual father of the empire. Yet the situation was dire. 80,000 bloodthirsty barbarians were at the gates, and the small garrison stood no chance if the fortifications were to be breached. Constantinople's walls have never truly been tested by a serious force before, and now, for the first time in history, she is surrounded on all sides. Heraclius was well aware of the situation and was presented with an impossible dilemma. If he rushed to the defense of the city, all of his progress would be reversed, and the Persians would soon get the upper hand. But if the city fell, the empire of the Romans would soon follow suit. After 3 sleepless nights, Heraclius decides on a daring plan. He sends a small detachment to the city's aid, praying it will be enough to push back the marauders, while he entrusts the rest of his force, under his brother Theodore, to face the 50,000-strong Persian army under Shahin. After both forces depart Pontus, the final part of his plan is sprang into action. He embarks on a ship and takes on a dangerous journey north of the Caucasus, to the land of the Gok Turks. It's in times like these that desperate measures have to be taken in the face of annihilation. The Gok Turks, a terrifying horde from the depths of Central Asia, had a fearsome reputation. Similarly to the Avars, they had deep disdain for sedentary peoples, believing them weak and fragile. Yet Heraclius, forged by 25 years of unceasing warfare, soon impressed the nomad Khan after they exchanged war stories around a campfire, and so they came to an agreement. The Gok Turks promised to invade Persia and help Heraclius end the war, and in exchange they could keep all loot they gather from the expedition. In the meantime, the capital of the civilized world was in terrible shape, as it endured one attack after the other. The once bustling streets now echo screams of agony, as flaming projectiles wreaked havoc, sparing no house and no civilian. The water supply was cut short, and food was running low, and the enemy was at the gates, ready to destroy and plunder the queen of cities. But faith never abandoned the Romans. Patriarch Sergios made sure that the whole city prayed together, asking Theotokos, the mother of Christ, to intercede and save the people, while the soldiers would desperately push back the incoming attacks again and again, until the prayers were finally answered. Reinforcements arrived from the emperor, who was still stationed in the east. Now the city's defenders numbered around 12,000 trained men, still outnumbered, but with the walls and the people's prayers on their side, they were ready to deal with any enemy. It would be on the 7th of August that the besiegers would launch a coordinated assault. Sharbaraz sent ships across the Bosporus Strait, while simultaneously the Slav vassals of the Avars would attempt to cross the Golden Horn with their wooden boats and climb the sea walls. Meanwhile, the Avars, having finally constructed huge siege towers and battering rams, numbering to a total of 80 siege engines, would assault the Theodosian land walls with all their strength, in an attempt to either destroy the gates or overrun the defenders. It was an attack from all sides, but the Romans would not stand idle. The city's dromons, the nimble and sturdy Roman warships, unmatched at the shallow waters of eastern Mediterranean, were manned and ready to face the attackers from the sea. While the wall defenders, now sufficiently reinforced, would perform one last prayer before fully manning the battlements and the tower's ballistae. Soon after the enemy fleet arrived at the city's walls, the experienced Roman marines would suddenly sail out and, in a masterfully executed counterattack, would make short work of the Slavic boats, while also annihilating the hastily built Persian fleet just before the seaborne force could create a real foothold in the city. In the meantime, the Avars were approaching from land, but much of their equipment would be destroyed by the defenders, torching the engines from afar using flaming projectiles and targeting the ox that pulled them with concentrated arrow volleys. Undeterred, the Avars and Slavs would soon reach the walls anyway, but the Romans were ready. The veteran troops of Heraclius's army, having fought for 2 decades in the Sasanian frontier, would coordinate the defenses on the city's weak points, slaughtering the countless lightly armed and undisciplined attackers. Nevertheless, their sheer numbers would soon come handy, as they would slowly push the defenders back to the secondary walls in many sections. The situation soon turned dire, as one by one the towers of the outer wall would fall to enemy hands. Morale was running low, and it seemed that all would be soon lost. It was in this crucial moment that the soldiers would witness an incredible sight. The 60-year-old patriarch Sergios was seen running back and forth along the 6-kilometer-long inner wall, urging the soldiers to keep fighting, and holding high the icon of the Most Holy Virgin Mary, claiming she would not abandon the Romans. The troops, with a newfound strength, launched a fierce counterattack, catching the enemy troops completely by surprise. Recapturing the outer wall and routing the attackers, the Avars would not budge. Seeing that they could push back the defenders before, threw another wave at the walls and another, and another. The battle soon turned into a slugfest, with the tired defenders slowly giving in once more. The Avar Khan turns his back, ready to ride his horse and join the imminent sack of the city, when suddenly half of his army turned and fled. The terrified Slavs speak of fast-moving soldiers with flaming swords burning down the siege towers, forcing them to retreat. The enraged Khan, not believing a single word, tried to rally his panicked troops, commanding them to get back to formation, but to no avail. His threats would hold no weight anymore. His equipment is destroyed, and half his army is dead or fleeing. With their spirits lifted, the Romans endured and managed to repulse the endless waves of the Avars. After coming close to the verge of destruction, Constantinople was saved, and her Avar enemies would disperse. Shabaraz witnessed the entire debacle unfold in front of his eyes, unable to directly engage the Romans when disastrous news arrived. Shahin's army was defeated by Theodore, Heraclius's brother. The battle was equal, with nobody able to gain ground, when a hailstorm is said to have turned the tide, striking directly at the Sasanian forces at a crucial moment. Shabaraz decided to abandon Asia Minor and return back to safety within Syria. With the news that the capital is safe and the subsequent defeat of Shahin's army, Heraclius breathed a heavy sigh of relief and swiftly capitalized on the moment. In early 627 AD, he mobilized his troops and led a 2-pronged assault with the help of his newly found allies, 40,000 Gok Turks, against the allied to the Sassanids, Georgians of Iberia. The increasingly paranoid Khosrow, learning that his generals failed him once again, and that Heraclius is in the offensive once more, has finally had enough. Shahin dies soon after under mysterious circumstances. his dead body brought into Ctesiphon and flogged by the king himself, while the immediate execution of Sharbaraz is ordered through a letter intercepted by Roman scouts. Heraclius took advantage of this golden opportunity and presented the letter directly to the once loyal Sharbaraz, who, infuriated, decided to betray Khosrow. He added 400 more names of other high-ranking officials on that list, so as to persuade his lieutenants to follow him in rebellion. And thus, with half the Sasanian army immobilized and the other half fighting the Gok Turks in Georgia, the road to the heart of Persia was open, and no real force could be mustered in time to stand in his way. There was one issue, however. It was winter, and the supplies were running low. Heraclius was presented with the only chance to end the war, and he was going to gamble everything once again. He took half his army so as to not have to feed as many mouths, and with a force of 20,000, marched south to capture Ctesiphon and depose the tyrant king of kings. Khosrow was now desperate. 10 years earlier, he would have never imagined that he would be the one on the verge of defeat. With none of his strongest generals left, he summoned a mysterious figure from the harsh mountains of Armenia, a loyal and fierce warrior named Rahzad, to whom he entrusted the defense of Mesopotamia against the advancing Romans. Once Heraclius entered Mesopotamia, Rahzad swiftly stalked him from behind. Heraclius, knowing he was being pursued, continued his march southwards, gathering all the supplies he could find in the region, thus stripping the Sassanids of their resources. But the troops could not forage far, lest they get intercepted by Rahzad's riders, and it was apparent that if they planned to survive, they would have to make a stand soon. Winter was already here, and so Heraclius sought for an ideal field to fight the Persians. Nineveh, the once mighty capital of the Assyrians, was now just ruins, a memory of past empires, none of which survived the test of time, a place that would decide the fate of the superpowers of this age. On the 12th of December, 627 AD, Rahzad ordered his troops to attack Heraclius's force. Rahzad was hoping that he would keep Heraclius pinned down, so that with the help of the additional Sassanid reinforcements on the way, he would be able to finish him off. But the emperor had other plans. He lured the Persians on the open plain with a feint retreat, where the Romans possessed significant advantage due to their advanced infantry tactics, as guided by the strategikon of Maurice, and thus he easily managed to repel them. Now the Persians, after retreating on the mountains, were in a disadvantageous position. But this could change if their reinforcements arrived on time. Thus, to prevent the Persian support from joining in time, Heraclius challenged Rahzad to single combat, a duel between the champion of Christ and Ahura Mazda, a fight to decide the future of two civilizations. The young and upcoming Armenian general was skilled and fast with the sword, yet the vigorous young man lacked what Heraclius earned through harsh lessons all these years: cunning and wisdom. While the 51-year-old Heraclius pretended to limp towards the confident Rahzad, when he got close, in a sudden movement, the emperor cut down Rahzad with a single, devastating strike, slicing his head off in one move. The Persian army, seeing the lifeless body of their leader amongst the ancient ruins, soon scattered. The road to Ctesiphon was open. Heraclius moved south towards Dastagerd, one of the many palaces of the King of Kings, a huge complex of immense riches and wealth. With no hesitation, the Romans plundered and burned it down, and among the spoils, the emperor found 300 stolen Roman banners, captured as trophies during previous Roman defeats. The dishonored fallen soldiers could now rest in peace. Khosrow, on the news of the approaching Romans, panicked and abandoned his capital, retreating to the mountains to gather whatever supporters he still had. Before his retreat, however, he ordered the demolition of a bridge leading to Ctesiphon, an obstacle that would slow Heraclius down significantly. Heraclius, seeking an end to the hostilities, writes a letter to Khosrow, urging him to surrender and prevent further bloodshed. But it was clear by now that Khosrow refused to accept the reality of the situation. The Mad King trusted nobody and would never accept a compromise with the Romans. Alone and isolated, the Persian court has had enough with him and would seek to end his reign to save their skins from Heraclius's sword. His son, the ruthless Prince Kavad, in a swift and brutal coup, imprisons Khosrow. To improve the legitimacy of the new regime, the rest of Khosrow's sons are executed right before his regretful eyes. He could have ruled a prosperous empire spanning from the mountains of Afghanistan to the shores of Alexandria. He could have been remembered as the ruler who humbled the Romans, a new Sarus who brought prosperity and united the Greek and Persian-speaking peoples into a new unified culture under the flame of Ahura Mazda. But his seed dies tragically before him, unable to do anything about it. He finally accepts the situation he put himself in, and soon gets disgracefully executed by arrow fire. The new king agreed to peace talks with Heraclius, and all of Persia rejoiced. In recognition of the new king, and wishing to create lasting peace, Heraclius would demand nothing more than a return to the status quo before the war. He would evacuate his troops from Mesopotamia, while Sharbaraz would also end the occupations of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. And most importantly, Sharbaraz would hand back the true cross, the cross on which Jesus sacrificed himself 600 years earlier, the cross that the Persians had stolen from Jerusalem on 614 AD. Thus Heraclius, after years of absence, finally returns to Constantinople, carrying with him the true cross. The people welcomed the emperor back as a hero, a man who saved the empire from the worst fate imaginable, although many have perished during the 26 years of combat, and the empire had lost much of its strength. Now, with an allied ruler on the Persian throne, and the prospect of long-lasting peace, the future finally looked bright for the Romans. Heraclius had achieved the greatest comeback in history, from finding the Eastern Roman Empire in its worst state than ever before, to forever crippling the Persian war machine in just a span of 5 years, leaving a forever lasting legacy. But this new age of peace that the Romans imagined would prove to be nothing more than a naive dream. Deep within the deserts of Arabia, a new faith was emerging, a movement without precedent in history, a religion that would trample empires before its path: Islam.